Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and try to get started on time. I wanted to thank you all for joining us to discuss the changing landscape of anti-corruption in Mexico. My name is Leslie Benton. I am a Vice President at the Center for Responsible Enterprise and Trade. We are a global nonprofit that focuses on working with companies to help them improve their systems, programs, and processes for preventing corruption. We work in a number of different geographies, sort of globally. And I'm joined today by Julio Copo, who is with the law firm of Bisham Ringue Correa in Mexico City. He is certainly our expert today on the issue at hand. Julio works on a variety of regulatory issues, including anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, among others. And so we're very pleased to have him with us today to discuss these important issues. Before we get started, and I hand it over to Julio, I thought we'd go over the agenda for the day and then just a little bit of background. I'm going to assume that we've got lots of experts on the phone with us today, but a little context setting will set up the discussion. So today we're going to cover sort of the global and local implications of, the real focus on anti-corruption that we're seeing in Mexico, the United States, Brazil, Europe, certainly really almost everywhere globally. We're going to really delve into some detail on the Mexican landscape, including recent laws and other reforms that have been enacted there, And then we'll move into a brief discussion of how companies are responding to the changing landscape and regulatory architecture and ways that companies can improve their compliance to make sure that they're meeting their legal obligations and setting themselves up to operate ethically in all of the markets where they work. So with that, I thought I'd talk a little bit about just the whole issue of corruption and why folks are so focused on it today. I mean, we know that it's a huge societal problem. You see some statistics that are discussed often. The World Bank has estimated that more than $1 trillion are paid in bribes worldwide. We know that it adds certainly to the cost of public procurement in every market, and in some markets up to 25% addition to the cost of public procurement. And we know that it's a huge risk and cost for business, certainly. You can pick up any newspaper today and you see the headlines about companies caught in corruption investigations and prosecutions. We certainly know that the United States is focusing very, very intensely on corruption in the private sector. And we'll talk a little bit about U.S. enforcement after Julio has gone into some detail on what's happening in Mexico. But just to sort of set the stage, the United States is enforcing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act at a very aggressive pace, and we see them enforcing against U.S. companies, but companies headquartered elsewhere around the world. And we know that the U.S. isn't alone, really, in enforcement efforts any longer. According to the most recent Transparency International report on enforcement by OECD countries, we're seeing active enforcement in Germany, Switzerland. We're starting to see enforcement in the UK and in Italy in terms of, in reforms on the legal architecture. In addition to what we're going to hear today about Mexico, we see new laws in China and Brazil. And we see sort of the focus on anti-corruption from other quarters as well. The multilateral development banks and other regional development banks are routinely conducting anti-corruption investigations of bank-funded projects. And there are really wide-reaching consequences for companies from that increased attention, including debarment. And, under the bank cross-debarment agreement, if you're debarred by one bank, you're debarred by all of them. This can have a huge impact on a company who relies on bank contracts for a significant portion of its revenue stream. And then we see those banks also referring cases out to country enforcement authorities, and those cases then being taken up and sort of run with. We also see external demand for good compliance coming from other quarters. Investors are particularly active in this area, requiring companies to provide information on their compliance efforts. And, in that regard, we've seen the European Union recently adopt a directive requiring companies to disclose information about their compliance programs and other non-financial information as well. But it's just an indication of this sort of a growing or increasing emphasis on anti-corruption. And I think that's really, really interesting for companies to note. We know, too, that the impacts of this increased attention go beyond just the financial costs that are associated with investigating and remediating a problem and going beyond debarment to things like disruption of business operations, opening yourself up to continued demands for extortion, certainly extensive demands on management time and attention, the reputational harm that comes from being caught in a corruption scandal. We've seen that played out with companies. We're seeing it in Brazil with Petrobras. And we're also seeing it with the FIFA scandal, although that's not technically a bribery case. It's a great example of what happens to an institution when it's caught in this kind of a scandal. So, that's a little background about why the increased attention these days on corruption. This is a heat map that comes from Transparency International's most recent Corruption Perception Index, which measures the perceived levels of corruption in public sector corruption, I should say, in countries around the world. And as you can see, where you see the red, more corruption, but you sort of see it across the globe. There really isn't a country that is not affected in some way by corruption. And then just a little bit more on the background. This is just a deeper dive into the Corruption Perceptions Index, which shows where some of the countries in the Americas region fall on the most recent index. And we see that the scores are not all that encouraging in some ways. No country has a perfect score on this year's index, and more than 2/3 scored below 50, which indicates pervasive corruption. And here we see Mexico ranked 103 out of the 177 countries that were included on this year's index. And I guess the country in the Americas that did the best was Canada, coming in at 10. But, this is an issue that sort of affects all countries. And as I've said, all countries are really focusing their attention on creating an environment that is less conducive to corruption, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So with that, I will turn it over to Julio to talk in more detail about what's going on in Mexico these days.
Thank you, Leslie. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Please bear in mind that English is not a first language for me, so please feel free to make any questions you may have, or please feel free to let me know if I'm not being clear enough in a specific topic, and I will be very glad to go back to it and to talk about it a little bit more. So as Leslie was saying, there's a very interesting panorama worldwide in terms of anti-corruption and compliance. As you know, well, these topics have definitely crept up the global agenda very fast, something that is moving frenetically. So the idea basically of today is simply go over what has been happening in Mexico and what we have been seeing here in Mexico, as for you to have a little more idea of what we can expect further down the road. Well, let me talk to you a little bit more about the legislative framework here in Mexico, in particular with anti-corruption. Until 2012, Mexico had only a couple of legislations related to corruption. There was the Federal Anti-Corruption Law for Public Procurement. We also had the Federal Criminal Code, Article 222 or Article 222, contemplating corruption. And in 2013, our Congress passed a bill for preventing and identifying operations with illicit resources. This one has to do a little bit more with money laundering and preventing money laundering. But this was, as I was saying, it was passed by Congress in 2013. It was enforced. It has recently been enforced, so it is something relatively new happening in Mexico in terms of anti-corruption and money laundering. And then something very interesting happened this few last months. On February of this year, the Chamber of Deputies voted in favor of a constitutional reform aiming to combat corruption with what is being called the National Anti-Corruption System. So this was approved by the deputies on February 2015. It was later passed down to the senators, who approved it on April 2015. And then, considering this was basically a constitutional reform. In terms of Mexican constitutional legislation, it also required the approval of half of the state's local congresses plus one. So this circumstance was rapidly achieved, we could say. And on May 27, 2015, the constitutional reforms that habilitated the creation of the National Anti-Corruption System were published on the Federal Official Gazette. No? I will talk a little bit more about this National Anti-Corruption System. I just wanted to point out that we are also looking at two laws with broad extraterritorial reach, the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, and the U.K. Bribery Act, and the possibility of the mutual legal assistance for international cooperation and the extradition for corruption cases in Mexico or in the U.S. We have talked a little bit about the Mexican anti-corruption law for public procurement before. I will try to be very brief with this law because this, as I was saying, was the only law that really dealt with anti-corruption prior to our national anti-corruption system. So this law was basically, as its name states, it was aimed to target corruption in public procurement processes, in public procurement or in public bids. It governs both domestic and foreign actions of Mexican companies and individuals. So it has an extraterritorial reach in terms of corruption in public procurement. Prohibited conducts include giving or offering a bribe, either directly or through a third party. We have resilient, but to a Mexican public entity and officials, or participating directly or indirectly in a public bid when you are not authorized to do so. It is possible that derived from past conduct in a public procurement process, the company is banned from public bidding from a period starting from 3 months and leading up to even 9 years. It has to do with the type of conduct carried out by the company. Companies, it is, well, being sanctioned in terms of this law does not mean that you could not be later sanctioned by a criminal conduct, or you can be subject of a civil or criminal investigation. This law, we can say that it is deficient in comparison with FCPA and UKVA. It applies for public procurement in Mexico or with Mexican companies, but it is also very important to keep in mind that unfortunately the system in Mexico apparently does not have the required technical skills. We are under the impression that public prosecution lacks adequate resources, that corruption requires a considerable amount of investigative work, and this has in the past allowed for very few successful corruption investigations, let alone indictments. So even though this Mexican anti-corruption law for public procurement existed, there was really not a lot in terms of results, rather than maybe imposing sanctions, economic sanctions to some companies, or forbidding them participating in public bids. Derived in some way by international pressure, but also looking at the poor results of Mexico in terms of corruption and how Mexico is being perceived, different sectors and different social groups started pushing towards a broader legislation in terms of anti-corruption. Diverse anti-corruption initiatives were filed for consideration of Congress as early as 2012. People were looking at, well, the change of government in 2013 that carried out several different, what was being called structural reforms. We had reforms in energy, we had reforms in telecommunications matters, in tax matters, political matters, education matters. But even though these reforms were aiming to modernize and promote Mexico as an optimal destination for international investment, the realization came, realization that came next, or hand by hand, to these structural reforms was that these reforms by themselves would not achieve what Mexico was expecting if a common topic for all of them that was proving to be a bigger challenge than expected was tackled, and this was corruption. So this last few years we have been looking at a lot of corruption scandals here in Mexico. We have the Oceanografía case with a public procurement process and a company dedicated to providing services to Pemex, the oil company, Mexican government oil company. We had another anti-corruption issue with the House of the President, that was leaked to the media. It was identified as the Casa Blanca because it's a White House. We also had a recent corruption scandal with a very high-level all-governmental officer in CONAGUA, which is the governmental agency in charge of water and in charge of water distribution in Mexico, in which he was using the helicopter of the company for personal use. So these, looking at, well, people and social pressures started building up because with the opening of other outlets of communication with social media, it is becoming very easy to demonstrate and to create evidence in terms of abuse of power and in terms of corruption. So this social pressure started building up in terms of corruption, and actually NGOs, academics, intellectuals started pointing out to corruption, say, we have a problem here and this is something that we need to tackle if we want these structural reforms to work. So this is probably the background of how this national anti-corruption system is being born. As I was saying, it was approved by the Senate and later by 22 local congresses. At this time, it is important to point out that this national anti-corruption system, at this time, it only refers to the constitutional changes that were made to habilitate the system, but at least we are expecting 5 other, what we refer to as legislative packages. We're expecting at least 5 other new legislations that will be required to fully implement this national anti-corruption system. So in terms of the constitutional reforms made, the Congress has a year for the implementation of these 5 legislative packages, so it will be interesting to see how this will develop from here and to a year. Let me tell you a little bit more about what these constitutional reforms to create the national anti-corruption system include. These are some bullet points of, it's a brief resume of these constitutional reforms, but basically the Congress will be able to legislate for establishing the national anti-corruption system. That's very obvious. The Auditoría Superior de la Federación, which is the governmental audit office of the Chamber of Deputies. The Auditoría originally could only get into prior years to investigate possible acts of corruption or possible misuse of governmental funds. So for the Auditoría to review something that a corruption case currently happening, they would have to wait for the year to be over. The public account would have to be closed, and then after the public account was closed for that year, the Auditoría could start their investigation. So in terms of this system, the Auditoría will now be able to review corruption cases as they develop and the misuse of governmental funds as they develop. So the Auditoría will no longer have to wait for the fiscal year to be over. This is interesting because aside from the Auditoría Superior de la Federación, we also had the Ministry of Public Function, and we still have the Ministry of Public Function, which is basically governmental office that depends on the president, that has offices in each governmental agency in the country, and they are in charge of receiving any sorry, I lost the word here, but they are the office is in charge of investigating possible acts of corruption within a specific governmental agency. So these two, the Auditoría and the Ministry of Public Function, will now work in parallel and will now be able to investigate corruption acts and the misuse of public funds. So instead of having just one authority, we will have 2 investigative authorities. Another interesting thing is that the Auditoría in the past could only get into reviewing the income or the federal income that was delivered to the states, but they could not get into reviewing the monies of each of the states, only those federal participations to the states. So derived from this constitutional reform, they will now also be able to review some matters of local income. So the Auditoría will now also be able to review the accounts of the states rather than just those of the Federation. Another interesting thing is that the Federal Tax and Administrative Tribunal, which currently exists, as its name says, for reviewing acts related to tax and administrative matters, it will change its name to the Federal Administrative Tribunal, and the Federal Administrative Tribunal will be habilitated to rule in case of grave corruption. They will be able, in this case, the Ministry of Public Function and the Auditoría will work as a ministry public. They will work as public prosecutors, and they will present a case to the Tax and Administrative Tribunal, or the Administrative Tribunal, and it will be the Administrative Tribunal who has capabilities for ruling in cases of grave corruption. So this was something that they could not do before, and it's something that will be done in terms of this new national anti-corruption system. And as I was saying, according to the constitutional reforms, the Congress has a year to implement all necessary secondary legislation to make this national anti-corruption system work. It will be interesting to see how this develops. People are still a little skeptical, in particular because, a year looks a little close in achieving all of this, and also because it is not only about making the necessary changes to the legislation, but also about providing certain skills and providing certain abilities to the people who will be in charge of the investigation and who will be in charge of integrating corruption cases. So notwithstanding, I can say that there is a lot of pressure from society. We are looking at, there is a lot of pressure from non-profits, from non-governmental organizations into making sure that these reforms are always in top of mind of the government, simply because we have now understand, or we are ready, we are convinced that Mexicans will not be willing to let go, and that the cost of doing so will impact a lot of generations to come. And this is time to invest in better days in terms of corruption. So impunity of governmental officials is something that society is taking very seriously. It's something that is being very criticized among Mexican society. The abuse of power for personal use, it's something that it's not being tolerated as it used to be, as I was saying, through social media outlets and through a lot of other means and sources of information. People are learning more and more about how government is moving in terms of corruption. So there is a lot of social pressure into making this happen. We have, it's also interesting in terms of enforcement. We do still have a lot, in particular in the private sector, derived from the investigation by the Department of Justice to Walmart, to HP, to other companies here, using the extraterritorial capabilities of the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Companies doing business in Mexico are understanding that they need to react quickly and efficiently to implement anti-corruption policies of their own and to regulate their national and international activities. The fear of an international investigation derived from FCPA or the UK Bribery Act has translated into and into an enhanced auditing between business partners, which in itself has resulted in a business culture more oriented towards transparency and towards more ethical standards, aiming to minimize corruption. These changes derive mainly from international corporate politics rather than national laws at this time, but it is very interesting to see how businesses are moving towards compliance and are moving towards anti-corruption policies, to codes of conduct to regulate this within their companies. And I think this is something that will continue to grow here in Mexico in particular for the years to come. But it is very interesting to see how the extraterritorial capabilities of international laws are in some way influencing very directly and very down to earth in Mexico, even though these are not really legislations, these are not national legislations. So it is something that I would like to point out as well. Companies are moving towards compliance, are moving towards anti-corruption, and no one wants to be subject of an international investigation. So we are moving towards a more transparent culture in that matter. Five particular industries or 5 particular areas in Mexico are prone to corruption. The first is construction. The second is industries that impact the environment. The third is the pharmaceutical industry. The fourth is the exploration of mines and oil. And number 5 is retail. These have been identified as the most vulnerable sectors to corruption. So we can also see a tendency towards the regulation, whether by the companies or by governmental officials of these sectors. Sorry, thank you. Well, some perspectives on the enforcement landscape in Mexico. We can continue to expect a coordinated international enforcement with international authorities, with the Department of Justice in the U.S., with the FBI. We are still uncertain about the enforcement guidelines, the national enforcement guidelines, and as I was saying, some people still perceive a lack of technical expertise by some national public entities. A fear of this new national anti-corruption system is that it will lead to long, inefficient proceedings, so we have to make sure that this national anti-corruption system will include proceedings that will allow for easier methods of resolution. As I was saying, contracts between business partners are driving local companies to design anti-corruption practices and abide to their fulfillment. It is also very interesting to see how corruption usually carries bad publicity for the company, whether nationally or internationally. So it is not only about the sanctions that the company may receive, whether national or international sanctions, but it's also about the name and the reputation, and that are badly tarnished because of a corruption scandal. We are seeing that the increased relevance of other legislation is moving local authorities towards a more strict monitoring of possible corrupt practices. Criminal sanctions are also a possibility in terms of corruption, usually include imprisonment and other fines. Corruption usually comes alongside illicit enrichment, fraud, and embezzlement of public funds. And, well, as I was saying, there is an increased social and public interest in the matter that was not there before. I don't know, Leslie, would you like to talk a little bit more about the U.S. enforcement part?
Yes, just very briefly, actually to underscore some of the points that you've already made. This is a slide that just shows some of the cases that the U.S. has brought over the last several years that involved conduct that actually took place primarily in other countries in the Americas region. And I just, just to sort of underscore, the U.S. takes a very broad view of jurisdiction when it comes to the FCPA. I mean, certainly, if you're an American company, an American citizen, but if you're an issuer, if you have securities listed on one of the U.S. stock exchanges, those are all things that will confer jurisdiction. But they also claim the right really to go after anyone who uses the U.S. banking system, including correspondent banks who are often used to clear payments, even if they're not the primary banks involved. Other things that have conferred jurisdiction are telephone calls, text messages, emails that go through a U.S. server, or any other use of interstate commerce in the U.S. So, very broad view of what confers jurisdiction, and so the FCPA is, as Julio says, very of significant interest to companies operating both in the United States, Mexico, and elsewhere. He mentioned the FBI, and I think that's something interesting to focus on for a moment. I was actually at an event last week where the head of the FBI FCPA unit made a presentation, and he was very clear on the increased resources that the FBI has in terms of people and money, but most importantly on the new focus on proactive detection, not just reactive investigation. But the FBI is really out there now, proactively engaged, trying to ferret out bribery in the U.S. or elsewhere and against U.S. or other companies. So that's also very, very important, I think, to note. And then I guess my last point, again, to underscore something that Julio has already said, is really on this issue of cooperation. This really is the new normal for companies. We are seeing enforcement authorities in one country working hand in hand with authorities in other countries to investigate and then prosecute these bribery cases. And one really good example of that is the case against Embraer, which is going forward in Brazil right now. But it began as an investigation in the United States, spearheaded first by the SEC and then joined by the DOJ. 4 years later, it was sort of handed over to the Brazilians who are prosecuting the company, and the U.S. still has its hand in the case as well and may very well prosecute here in the United States. So, this international cooperation that Julio has mentioned is another very important factor for companies to think about when they are thinking about the risk that corruption poses to them. So I think that's those are the main points I wanted to make. So back to you, Julio.
Thank you, Leslie. So, some key takeaways. We are expecting enforcement by Mexico in terms of corruption. We are expecting authorities to start getting themselves involved with a more aggressive enforcement nationally in terms of corruption. We can also expect a continued aggressive enforcement by the U.S. As you know, this has become a very relevant topic in the United States, and they are moving forward, and they are moving very, very strictly for compliance and corruption matters. We are looking at the enforcement in multiple jurisdictions, so an investigation starting in Mexico can later lead to an investigation in China, an investigation in India, an investigation in the U.S. This is very interesting because we will now have international companies being subject to investigations in multiple jurisdictions. Public procurement proceedings, we can expect that they will Mexican authorities will continue to strengthen anti-corruption measures when dealing with public procurement proceedings. Our public procurement law allows for the direct assignment of certain contracts when it is justifiable to do so, but what we can expect is that these contracts will really become fewer and fewer in the years to come. The ideal for the state is or for Mexico is that everything or most of the things that are acquired by government are subject to a process of public procurement. We can also see, or we can also expect for the foreseeable future, a closer scrutiny of compliance programs for companies. These compliance programs will have to be risk-based, will have to extend throughout the organization to other subsidiaries, to different levels of operations, to different structures within the same companies, even to third-party providers. So it is very interesting. As I was saying, I think this is simply we are looking at the genesis. We're looking at the start of a lot of movement to come in terms of corruption, not only internationally but also in terms of the country, in terms of Mexico. I don't know, Leslie, would you like to talk about how our company is responding today? Hello?
Sorry, I had myself on mute. There was
Don't worry.
Yeah, there was an ambulance passing behind me, and I was afraid the siren would interrupt the webinar. But I was saying, why don't you go ahead, Julio, maybe, and say a few words about what you're seeing in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America, and I'll follow up with what I'm seeing in the United States.
Sure. Well, it is very interesting, as I was saying, what we've been looking at in Latin America and in Mexico. From the corporate perspective, we are definitely looking at an evolution in compliance programs. Companies, in particular international companies, are moving towards very strict compliance controls and very strict anti-corruption controls. There has been a lot of training to different levels of not only management but also the operations and their third-party providers, simply to make sure that they are aware of the code of conduct that they should abide, the ethical codes that the company expects from them. As lawyers, we are increasingly seeing anti-corruption clauses and FCPA clauses in everyday transactions and everyday agreements. We are also looking at a lot of mergers and acquisitions that are taking a particular emphasis on getting a very close due diligence in terms of compliance. So it is very interesting to see how even though Mexico still does not have a solid legislation in terms of corruption, and even though Mexico is still moving towards that process, companies are getting ahead and are taking part of other international policies and are bringing into their companies some international policies in terms of corruption. So even formal processes are still developing, but we are seeing that it is something that definitely has become a top-of-mind thing for companies doing business in Mexico, which is something that we are very glad to see. It has been said before that, well, corruption might be a cultural thing. However, we feel this is just a way to justify corruption, and it's something that should not be enough reason for this to be true. So I can tell you that things are definitely moving forward towards we need to get rid of this. This is costing Mexico too much. This is making us very inefficient, and we really want governmental officials and we really want society to move towards a more ethical, towards a more transparent ways of doing business, simply because we have understood that this is better for all of us. So it is very interesting to be part of this process here in Mexico, because as I was saying, this is just starting to grow, and this is something that has just started to evolve, but I think it is something that will definitely be a change maker down the road. We still believe that some training and education is required in terms specifically for local authorities, for authorities investigating corruption cases. We would like to see more prepared public prosecutors. We would like to see a more in-depth work in terms of investigation. So hopefully the secondary legislation will also be very, very wide and very broad about what can be done in terms of education for people investigating corruption and for people investigating misuse of public funds, because this is a key element, I think, in terms of corruption. If we do not have strong enough evidence, if we do not have strong enough investigations, then unfortunately we will not be able to really make a stand towards corruption or make a stand to corruption from the national perspective. But this is basically a general overview of what has been happening here in Mexico. And I think Latin America, well, from my understanding, is some countries are more advanced, some countries are still looking at better ways to tackle corruption. Some of them are still very backed up. But it is also very interesting to see what has been happening in Brazil in terms of the car wash operation, how with new tactics and with new training to public prosecutors, with new strategies, including the possibility of whistleblowing programs, including the possibility of collaboration with authorities, how this allows for a broader investigation and how this allows for actually getting a cartel of corruption when investigating, instead of simply investigating one or two people, just actually being able to identify a complete corruption chart involving all the different stages of corruption and how it has developed. So it is very interesting what Brazil is doing, and I think Mexico should also look at Brazil and see, okay, what experiences have they achieved? How can we learn from the Brazilian experience as well?
Great. Thank you so much, Julio. That was a really good introduction to what I'm going to talk about now, which is what an effective compliance program looks like. And I say this really with an understanding that there is now a global consensus about good compliance. And there are guidelines that companies can turn to if they are trying to implement a new program or benchmark an existing program. And they're really global guidelines, and that's the point I want to make. If you're a company doing business in Mexico or the United States or China, these guidelines are equally helpful to you. And they come from a number of authoritative sources. You see some of them here. The OECD has issued good practice. So has the World Bank. The World Bank has integrity guidelines, and I wanted to mention that just in light of my earlier comments about the rising influence of enforcement by the multilateral development banks and the regional development banks. There are also voluntary initiatives like the World Economic Forum Partnering Against Corruption Initiative and Transparency International that have issued model codes and guides that companies can use. So, this is good global guidance that any company can use as they're thinking about either developing or improving a program that they have in place today. So just a little bit on what that looks like, and I'll try to go through this pretty quickly so we can leave some time for questions. I see some questions already at the end. But there are a few just sort of commonalities that come from these guidelines and, from some of the expectations that we see from regulators and enforcement authorities. And I start with risk assessment. Julio mentioned this earlier. in his comments, and it's absolutely true. Certainly in the United States, we know from settlement agreements that the Justice Department and the SEC have entered into and guidance that they have published on compliance with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that they're looking for a risk-based approach to compliance. So that you should be doing a very tailored risk assessment, looking at your own industry, the markets where you work, your own business structure, whether you use third parties consistently, sales agents, for example, really looking at where your risks are and then tailoring what for most companies are scarce resources, both in terms of money and human resources, to a program that actually addresses those risks. And I think that's just sort of the threshold of all of these discussions about good compliance, understanding your actual risks and then going out and developing a program that addresses them, rather than trying to take something off the shelf or from another company, really tailoring to your own circumstances. That's the very most important part. Certainly, you're expected to have clear policies, sort of the rules that your employees and others with whom you work need to follow, and then implementing those policies through clear procedures, actually guidelines on how to comply with the policies. It's always interesting to me, the companies that we work with that have great policy documents, but they haven't then taken the next step to actually implement those policies into clear steps that employees can take in their daily business life to ensure that they're following those policies. Certainly among your procedures should be financial controls that are tailored to money flows in and out of your company. But that's sort of threshold, policies, procedures, and then records, record keeping. And I'm not talking about your books and records now, but really, are you keeping records about your compliance program so that if the Justice Department or another enforcement authority comes knocking, you can show them this is what our compliance program looks like. Here are the records to prove that we've actually implemented it, that we've trained on it, that we monitor it, and so on. So that's very, very important, having a documented program. By compliance team here, we really just mean in the company having someone in charge. Who is that person or persons? Do they have support from senior management? Do they have proper resources? Are they independent so that they can really investigate issues and raise them to the highest levels within the company, whether that's the C-suite or a board, the supervisory authority if a company has a board? Are they able to do that without being impeded in their job? So we're looking there for sort of responsibility for the issue inside the company. By supply chain management here, we're talking about a couple of different things. One is doing effective due diligence on your business partners. And that just really means investigating them enough to be able to make an evidence-based decision about whether you should work with them or continue a relationship with them. And what you're looking for, of course, are indicia that they pose a corruption risk to you. So, what kind of a process do you have there? And then I see a question about contracts. We look at that here too. Contracts are a necessary but insufficient part of a compliance program. You need to have them. You need to have the protections in the contract. You can't rely only on contract provisions. But again, something very important, getting representations and warranties, getting rights to terminate if something goes wrong. Julio mentioned training. That's very, very important. And not just annual training, but maybe more frequent informal training. Some of the companies that we work with use burst training, which means just 5 minutes here or there on a particular issue, gifts, for example, or on the whistleblower protections that a company might have, which Julio mentioned is extremely important. And that's my next category here. Having reporting mechanisms, but not just reporting, actually a way to ask questions. People have questions about whether certain things are right or wrong. And you need to have a way that those questions can be raised to the appropriate level in a company. And then the last two pieces really kind of go hand in hand, which is monitoring. That means taking a good look at your program, making sure that it's working, and every part of your program. Are your policies really meeting your risks? Is your training effective? Are your employees getting it? Do they understand what they are supposed to do? Are people using your reporting mechanisms? Really looking at all the parts of your program, and then whatever information you get from that, feeding it back into the system and taking corrective action. Enforcing if you have a problem, or filling gaps in the program if you just see weaknesses that have to be filled. So the idea is that your program becomes a living, breathing thing that is continually improved and continually responding to the changing risks that you face as a company, whether it's entering a new market, having a relationship with another partner, a new joint venture, for example, a new transaction, so that it's not something that's static, but really something that's dynamic and living and breathing. So that's sort of my very quick thumbnail sketch of what a good compliance program should look like. And we've saved a few minutes, for some questions. And I see one for you, Julio. Carlos asks, how would this national anti-corruption system be expected to change the situation in Mexico, which he mentioned earlier? Companies are using contracts, getting certifications that no party to the transaction will be involved in corruption, but as a practical matter, sometimes you have to maybe skirt the rules to get the deal done. So how would this national anti-corruption system change that situation?
Well, it's actually very interesting. I am not sure, as I was saying, the national anti-corruption system at this time is only at a constitutional level. So these secondary legislations that are required will probably have to deal with these issues in a more closely, I would say. However, I think that whether the national anti-corruption system does or does not specifically refer to this type of practices to guarantee or to continue a business in Mexico, I think that it is very important to be very clear when dealing with the authorities from the very first start to say, all right, well, we are this company and we have to abide to these international rules, and we are part of, we have a very strict compliance program. We are part of a group of companies that have business elsewhere in other parts, not only in Mexico but also internationally. And I think it's really about making a stand and educating authorities as well in terms of compliance policies and in terms of compliance programs within the companies, and say, unfortunately, I cannot be part of what you are proposing simply because we have very strict controls for this, and we have very strict controls for that. And they usually understand it at this first level. If they don't, well, there are definitely always different alternatives. The first of them would be to go directly to their hierarchy, to their superior within the structure of the agency, and talk to them about what you're trying to achieve and what has been asked of you. Not necessarily trying to create a big trouble around you are being asked to pay for a bribe, but rather actually trying to say, okay, I am subject to international standards, I am subject to different codes of conduct, and I really have to get this through. And I have to do it in an ethical way, and I have to do it in a transparent way. And there's also always the internal organ or the internal control organ in the governmental agencies, that it's also a possibility to appear before them and file a complaint of the service that is being provided or the requirements that are being made by governmental officials. I understand Carlos' question because we see it every day, and it is something that unfortunately still goes on, in particular with local governmental officers. And well, simply as I say, I think it is a very good approach to the first contact we have with authorities to give them the whole panorama in terms of corruption, the whole panorama of where we stand as a company in terms of bribery, what the policies are for our company when dealing with governmental officials. And it is, as I was saying, it is a matter of educating the authority as well. So in particular with the national anti-corruption system, I am not completely sure how it will change this situation. Of course, it will lead to establishing harder sanctions for governmental officials participating in corruption. It will also definitely include the possibility of being subject to responsibility procedures, not only before their internal organs or their internal control organs, but also before the Federal Administrative Tribunal. So I think it is also a matter of companies and people going before the government to actually make a stand whenever they are being pushed into corruption and say, this is something that we cannot do, this is something that we will not tolerate, and simply try to push forward into educating the authority as well in terms of corruption. So hopefully the national anti-corruption system will be broad enough to cover this aspect. I think this is a very particular part of it, but I think it is part of also creating a culture of anti-corruption, a culture of compliance that is something that we are moving towards and something that we are that we aspire to achieve down the road.
Thank you, Julio. That was really interesting, and I want to thank everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about these important topics. And I learned a lot today, and I hope that you all did as well. We're out of time. We've gone a little bit over, and I apologize. So if there are other questions that anybody has, here's my email, and here's Julio's email as well, and we hope that you'll feel free to contact us, and we'd be very happy to answer any additional questions that you have. But with that, I would say good afternoon, have a great day, and thank you again for joining us.